Hello, class. Welcome back to History 1301. We'll be doing part 2, chapter 4. It's called Slavery, Freedom, and the Struggle for Empire. Part 1, we talked about slavery, mostly. Actually, part 1 was just about slavery. And now we talk about the notions of freedom and the struggle for empire. All right, so let's talk about this notion of this so-called Empire of Freedom, which is here namely the British Empire. So even though the British Empire was central, highly active, and by 1750, as I mentioned, was pretty much the main leader in the transatlantic slave trade, this 18th century Great Britain. So Great Britain came to being in the year, was at 1707. So this is Great Britain is referred to England and Scotland uniting to create Great Britain. This was the Act of Union of 1707. Before 1707, it was just England, right, or Britain. Now we have Great Britain. Just a little caveat there. Anyways, 18th century Great Britain prided itself on being the world's most advanced and freest nation, despite it being central to the slave trade. It was an empire of freedom, as they would call themselves, quote unquote. It had, for example, it was just ruled by a monarch, an absolute monarch. For example, France did, and it was not under the control or influence of any pope, right? It was popish tyranny. It had this complex system of parliamentary monarchy, right? The parliament broken down into two chambers: the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and then you have the king, and then you have this the whole array complex system of checks and balances there, right? Representing supposedly, right, this parliament, the interest of the landed aristocracy and the merchant class primarily. So they had that going on, right? London being a really big city back then too, approaching about 1 million people by the 18th century. So Great Britain, right, in this whole notion, possessed like a single political, cultural, economic identity, right? Capital, I'm going to call it that. That's Eric Foner does. So that's this right, this more or less, not, I guess more or less homogenous, you could say, a political, cultural, and economic identity. Right? British. Had a common law, right? English common law, had a common language, English language. And it really, I mean, with a few exceptions of very few Jews, Catholics here and there, and Africans, mostly servants, the common religion was Protestantism. Right? And then remember, right, contrary to its imperial neighbors, right, its imperial rivals, namely Spain and France. So Spain first becomes its main rival, and then France becomes the main rival of England. Right, so Spain, we have the Black Legend, right, of Spain, and then being uniquely brutal for the colonization of the Americas. Notwithstanding that, the English were just as brutal as well against Native Americans. But anyways, the Spanish have that going on for them, or against them, the Black Legend. So, whereas Spain is the empire of this Black Legend, right? Or the empire of freedom, is British. And then the French. What's wrong with the French, right? With the French, you can't really say they're like brutal with those Native Americans, because in fact, France has the best diplomatic relations with Native Americans, as amongst all these other European powers, namely because they want to get into the fur trade. So what they do have against the French is that they're Catholic, right? Mostly Catholic at this time. So they're under the control of the Pope and stuff. So they have this popery, right? We have that going on against them. And they're just basically Britain and France. I mean, they've always kind of just have animosity against each other. But by the 18th century, for sure, now France becomes the main rival. We have this shift here. And because of these imperial rivalries, and France being pretty closer, way closer to England than Spain. The English monarchy, especially under the prime ministry of William Pitt. We'll talk about Pitt later on when we talk about the 7 Years' War. But you have this increased militarization, right? Increased spending on military ventures, which means increased taxation on people. So a bigger state is happening here for the English, and a pretty massive navy as well. That's something that the British definitely do have. Is superiority in the navy capacities. So all of this stuff, basically, long story short, sharpens, right? It magnifies this national identity. So keep in mind that right now the colonists, right, whether you're in Virginia, in Carolina, or New England, you know, the concept, right, of being American, right, us, right, as we do now, non-existent back then. That does not exist at all. You're first and foremost, you're British. You're a British subject, you're a citizen. And then, I mean, if you're a little bit more radical, I guess, you may call yourself a Carolinian or Virginian, right, from the colonies, or a New Englander. You won't call yourself American, right? There is no American identity at all right now. There is definitely, though, a British one. And this British identity saw itself as, at the realm of spreading, right, Protestantism, this individual liberties of parliamentary representative governments and stuff, okay? As opposed to the empires that were, Catholic. You had the Pope under them or whatever. All right. Right, so we have the House of Commons, the House of Lords. Let's talk about these some ideologies really underscoring these British, I guess, identity of this freedom of empire, right? Of this empire of freedom, I mean. I guess one thing I should mention before I move on here is that something to keep in mind here is that Britain also had experience, right? Had been just gone through, right, the Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, right, Restoration, we call it. And so this after this, right, there was a strong, a stronger sense of national identity as well. Right, so not only does so the British doesn't have like a written constitution, but it has a set of ideas, right, of common norms, right, social political parameters, you want to call it this, culture, constitute, basically, right? It's not a written constitution, but these ideals, right, constitute, make up, right, the British polity, the British politics, state, and government. But it's not just this like specific rights, but it's also, right, this national character and this state of mind, English liberty. Even though, keep in mind, though, we're pushing slaves across the Atlantic at this time as well. Okay. All right. One thing, though, that the British did have going for them is that they did believe that no man was above law. Right? It's rule of law, right? Because we went through the Civil War against this, right? That not even the king is above law, right? Above this, the law is, right, the rule of the land. There's also a flourishing, a big expression, right? Availability of expression of ideas. Um, and it wasn't just held for voters or office holders, royal officials, whatever. Right? This expression, this political expressions of liberty, was very common amongst laborers in Britain. Okay? Uh, the public sphere is here what I'm talking about. The public sphere was very vibrant, it was burgeoning at this time period. And one of the specific locations of the so-called sphere, right, would be like the forum in Roman times, at least. And now in this time period, and even today, I guess you call it into you have forums, right? Online forums where you just blogs, right? But back then, you also have like taverns, coffee houses. These served as prime centers where people, right, from politicians to laborers, would just come together for a beer or two and just talk the shit, right? Just talk politics, new ideas and stuff. So there's that going on here as well in England. This so-called, as Fawn recalls it, the language of liberty. So for some of these ideas that are being spilled here, right, across the beers and stuff, I should have brought a beer instead of this chai to make it more apropos to this lecture. Let's see. So this idea, right, is so first one, the first one I'm talking about is going to be Republicanism. It's the first one that your book actually mentions. Republicanism, right? So what is this idea, right? So it's like this active participation in public life. The nation, right, is best served by this vibrant public sphere. And the Republicans, the so-called Republicans, the essence of liberty laid on these economically independent men, citizens, mostly men, right? Red men, basically. So Republicans, in this republicanism idea, is that you had a willingness to subordinate self-interest for the greater public good. This is crucial, right, in public life. Is this virtue, your willingness to give up some rights, to give us some of your interests in order for the greater public good. So it's not just a matter of like personal, right, moral qualities, but this capability, right, of securing for the greater good. And I guess that's as far as I go into republicanism. I think one thing you got to keep in mind, though, is that republicanism, where the emphasis here for republicanism was on the political role of these independent, wealthy landowners as a means to curtail or to check the power of concentration of political power, or not the concentration of political power, but infringements on personal liberty, on these English liberties. And then the kind of like the big second kind of like ideology that was being debated, spilled about at this time period as well, was what became known as liberalism. and not the same liberalism as today, right? Like who's a liberal now? Because Biden, I don't think Biden's liberal; he's more of the centrist. I guess who was it? Uh, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? She's liberal. Um, Omar Ilan from Minnesota, also liberal. What was here from the local? Beto O'Rourke. People say he's a liberal. Right? Not that kind of liberal. Right? This is a different kind of liberalism. This is like the original definition of liberalism. Right? So liberalism is should be the individual, right? It's the individual, the private individual should be free, right? Should be at liberty, liberal, right? To promote his own greater good, and thus this will promote the greater good of all at large. Uh, so there's a big stark here difference between republicanism during this time period. Again, not the same republicanism as now. Republicanism, as I just defined it earlier, just now, and the liberalism. Republicanism back here is about like you give yourself up some interest for the greater good. It is about the public and social equality of things. Republicanism and liberalism here is essentially an individual and private affair. Okay, so it's almost it's almost like you switched the definitions now from what it is today to back then. Basically, kind of weird how that works. Um, but liberalism, the main proponent of liberalism is this guy named John Locke. Remember John Locke? He was a secretary for Ashley Cooper. He was one of the proprietors for South Carolina colony. Also, a big head, a big official in the Royal African Company. And John Locke was his secretary. John Locke helped him write the Constitution for South Carolina. It was eventually rejected by the king. But within that Constitution of South Carolina, it had a lot of these liberal ideas that would eventually become part of our own U.S. Constitution. These ideas of life, liberty, and property, right? Which was in our Constitution was transformed into life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But the happiness is undermined by having property, land, and slaves. Anyways, liberalism, right? Under this philosopher, right, of John Locke, right, and there's this famous book called The Two Treatises of Government, published in 1680. And then it had this idea. I mean, he's a contrarian, just like Thomas Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes has this idea of the social contract, right? So just like republicanism, here you give up some of your rights in order for greater protection. So for Thomas Hobbes, so he justifies the need, basically, he says, for a strong government, whether be it a king or a very strong central parliament, right? The so-called Leviathan. Right, so Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan. So Thomas Hobbes says that you give up some of your freedom in order to have safety, in order to be safe. And you give your freedom up to a king, and the king is going to protect you, certain rights, namely the right to live from being attacked, being killed. John Locke kind of uses the idea of the social contract and modifies it quite a bit. And this idea of the social contract is that, yes, man, surrender a part of their own right to govern themselves in order to benefit from the rule of law. But this rule of law is not at the hands exclusively of the strong Leviathan, of the strong monarch, of a strong government, central government. I mean, it is, but the important thing about here, the thing that John Locke adds basically here, is this addition of this idea of natural rights. These natural rights the protection of the security to life, liberty, and property. These natural rights, says John Locke, they predate any establishment of any social contract, any establishment of any government. Thus, before, these are natural rights. These are not what we call positive rights that are created by governments. And so, for example, a positive right would be like a right that could be taken away by a government. So, the right to drive, I guess, would be an example. That could be taken away by a government, and sometimes that's very justifiable. Some people should not be driving at all, right? But these natural rights, those are given to you by God, says John Locke. These are God-given rights. No government, nobody should be able to take those away from you. Security of life, liberty, and property. Right, so these include your family relations, your private affairs, basically your religious preferences, and whatever economic activity you want to pursue. These rights, those are God-given. No government. These predate. These come before any government. So yeah, we might give up some governments in the social contract, some rights, some freedoms, in order to enjoy the rule of law. But these particular ones, life, liberty, and property, nobody's gonna mess with those. That's John Locke, liberalism. And then another modification, another Lockean idea that he gives to the social contract is that these individual rights, if somehow they're being infringed, somehow they're being taken away, threatened, you have the right to rebel, right? You have the right to get rid of whoever is your Leviathan and replace it with somebody who's going to respect those things. Pretty much this is the concept of the consent government. Those who are giving up their rights must have consent, must be okay with that. So this is pretty much the basis of Lockean liberalism. And and yeah, even though he proclaimed it to be like a universal right, I mean, it was obvious that John Locke only had in mind property to white men, right? So a white man that has property. But nonetheless, like these ideas of liberalism still open up the door for slaves and women in particular to claim these natural rights as well for them. All right. So that's republicanism and liberalism, more or less in a nutshell. So right, so the public sphere here. We start talking about this. Let's see what your textbook has here, real quick. All right, so the most obvious way to participate in the public sphere, besides just drinking away in a tavern and just spilling the shit, is voting, right? When you're watching this here, we just recently had an election, milestone, groundbreaking election. Just got Trump out if he doesn't commit a fascist coup, as it seems like he is. But anyways, we just had an election, local, state and federal, right? Presidential election, 2020, November. So the right to vote, but back then the public sphere was not. I mean, it was expanding, but not as much. Right? Remember, this chapter is all about expansions and the restrictions of liberty. So ownership of property was one of the most common qualifiers to be participating in the public sphere as a voter. And because of this, right, ironically, I want to say this, right, or maybe not so. I mean, it makes logical sense. Because property ownership was a qualification for voting, suffrage, which means just being able to vote, the right to vote, suffrage was bigger in percentage here in the colonies than it was in the motherland, in England. Remember England, right? They have the enclosure movement. There wasn't much, right, to own. There wasn't much land to own in England. So only very few people in England actually voted, right? Actually were represented by parliament. The rest of the masses are, wage laborers that had no land. So one of the main push factors that, push immigrants to come to the New World was the availability of land in North American colonies. So that's that. um, so the wide distribution of property in the colonies meant that a higher percentage of people voted here in the colonies. So I'll just give you some statistics real quick here. About 50 to 80% of adult white men could vote in 18th century colonial America, whereas in the same time period, only 5% of English men voted in England, in Britain. So it was obviously it was for men. It was a male prerogative, the public sphere for politics. Jews, Catholics, and some other dissenters were not able to vote. Makers, most colonies. Of course, there was variations. I'm just here giving you some commonalities. And let's see. But some variations here is basically based upon who was in power. So, like for example, in South Carolina, there was specific property qualifications for certain levels of government. So almost everybody could meet the qualifications. Almost every white male, at least, could meet every qualification for voting, which was to own 50 acres at least to vote in South Carolina. But to hold office, though, you had to own at least 500 acres. Okay. And 10 slaves or property equals about 1,000 pounds, British pounds. So this basically means that virtually all of the legislators in South Carolina were wealthy plantation slave owners. So little variations like this in here and there. Right? I won't go into too much detail into specific colonial, right, political makeups because it will take forever here. But there's some variations here. Nonetheless, property ownership, right, was a commonality, mostly for white males. And then there was also this idea of political deference among people that didn't have the right to vote because they didn't have ownership. So deference is like, like, it's like you defer, you know what I mean? Like these people are educated, right? These wealthy landowners are educated, and they have access to education, they have money, so they're in a better position to lead. So that was a very common kind of idea also in colonial America. Right? Another common idea or practice in colonial America was this idea of salutary neglect. The salutary neglect is what happened here is that Great Britain, right, in Britain and England, was very preoccupied already The Imperial Wars over there in Europe, in continental Europe. So basically, the British government, Parliament in London, left the colonial governments for themselves, to fend for themselves, to do for themselves. And they for the first half of the 18th century, and from 1700 to 1750, England was mired in too many problems in Europe already. That they didn't have the time, or the money, or the energy, or whatever means to control its colonies directly. So they adopted this policy of salutary neglect, basically leaving them to govern themselves. So these large landowners, slave owners, these merchants and lawyers, right, increasingly controlled what we call these assemblies. What are the assemblies? The assemblies are basically the colonial governments, or state governments, if you want to call them that now. These are each colony had these assemblies, these elected assemblies, but more and more so these landowners and rich owners, because under salutary neglect, there was no seeing them. They would manipulate the elections or whatever, and control politics, right? Like South Carolina did, right? But their with property qualifications of having to have 500 acres plus 10 slaves to become a legislator. And what you have here now is with the rise of these assemblies as well, you have the rise of this tension between the governor, who's the executive here, and then the assembly, right, the colonial government. So you have that going on as well. You have also an increase of colonial presses, so newspapers as well. Which was the first newspaper here, I'm sure. The Boston Newsletter was the first one. It appeared in 1704. That was the first, I guess, first continuously published colonial. There's all those other newspapers before that. They were like shut down because of censorship laws and stuff. Basically, by 1740, by 1765, most colonies had their own newspapers. They had their weeklies and stuff. So by 1730s, political commentary in these newspapers was widespread across the colonies. So you have the colonial press as well, right? Which is also very, very essential, right, for the so-called public sphere and this freedom of expression. So-called freedom of expression. Because back then, the phrase, as a matter of fact, freedom of speech did not exist. But it existed. It originated in 16th century, in the 1500s, in Parliament, and the freedom of speech was reserved just for Parliament members, for people, for legislators to debate among themselves. But anybody else was allowed to be hung for libel or for betrayal, or contempt, or whatever. So that freedom of speech, for back then, was limited initially for the Parliament, legislators. But slowly, right, as the public sphere began to expand, right, this freedom of speech began to shift and also expand in definition to include not just legislators and politicians, but people as well. All right. Another example of the limitations of this public sphere is the so-called trial of John Peter Stenger in 1735. He was this German-born printer in colonial America, in New York, I believe it is, New York. And he had this newspaper called the Weekly Journal. And he would lambast. He would always talk shit about the governor, about his corruption and his political dealings, and basically he was charged. He was put on trial for seditious libel. Um, and even though he was found not guilty, um, it basically put a warning on people, like, yo, you could put the trial on this. Like, it's not just freedom of expression for everybody. There is limits to what you could say or not say. But nonetheless, right, this right, freedom of expression was beginning to be implanted in colonial America's, in these colonist minds. All right. Let's talk about another movement besides, Republicanism, Enlightenment, and this public that also shaped colonial America during this 18th century was the Great Awakening, the so-called Great Awakening. So this was during the 1730s. What happened here, the Great Awakening, is this a bunch of series of so-called religious revivals, and this was a transatlantic movement. It was global. It was not just uniquely, exclusively a phenomenon of North American colonists. It's happened everywhere. Where it happened in the Islamic world. Um, it happened with Native Americans. Right? It was kind of like a response towards Enlightenment. It was a reaction against Enlightenment thinking. This burgeoning, this expansion, this increase of dependency of reason, rationality to explain the world instead of using religion and God, whatever. Right? These mythopoetic explanations, right, being replaced by rational explanations. Right? This is the Enlightenment. The Great Awakening, right, was a reaction to that. Right? So Islam and Judaism in Asia also went revivals. And these fundamental revivals are going back to like how it was a day. This rise of fundamentalism. So Wahhabism, for example, in Islam, began to rise around this time period as well in 1730s. It's like a really fundamentalist form of Islam. Yeah. So, anyways, here in New England, right in the colonies, and you have these preachers, preachers just like Jonathan Edward or George Whitefield. Especially George Whitefield was very famous back then. We're called this itinerant preachers, this itinerant ministers, this itinerary movement. Basically means that they didn't have like a specific permanent, congregation, church. And they would just roam around. Right? So for example, George Whitefield would go around England, and then when he went to New England, right, to the colonies, he went to all the colonies at the time, and would give out these like fiery speeches. Right? That would just, were famous, were popular among the colonists, among people, just grabbed their attention. And it was all about, this Great Awakening was about like about salvation of your own self, right? About greater religious tolerance. Right? It was open for Indians and slaves as well. Right? It emphasized the separation of church and state, which would be unthinkable in Puritan Massachusetts. And this lessening of dependence on institutionalized religion, right? This is your own private affair. So that's what these are all about. It's these revivals, these preachers. So George Whitefield, right, he once said the whole world is his parish. So you're not just thinking into New England in one town. You're going all around spreading the word of God. And So, I mean, this is what we call evangelist, right? Which means basically the bearers of good news. So these would just come on and bring good news, namely that you're not forced into damnation, that man and woman, that anybody could be saved from sin. And they just, become very, very pious. It's not, you don't have to like be under the control of anybody else or nothing like that. You save yourself. um, so you have this emergence of the so-called this schism here in Protestantism in New England and the American colonies of the old lights, those that want to hold on to like this traditional way of doing religion and, and traditions, and the new lights, which are like these centers that are following the footsteps of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, these revivalists. Um, so let's see. Some of the consequences here. Um, so first of all, it was like a new revived, right, as they call it, the spirit of piety in Christianity and in American Christianity. It revived this piety, right, this faithfulness and optimism. Right? Whereas Puritans, right, would teach damnation, these people focus on salvation, right? And that was popular, right? That attracted people, and that threatened the power that institutions, religious institutions, have had before this, especially in New England. Secondly, they established this ethic, this way of delivering sermon, and that became uniquely American. This evangelists, right? Now you see them everywhere, right? They have their own TV and stuff now, mega churches and stuff. So that is also kind of like a legacy, a consequence of this great awakening. But most importantly, finally, is that they represented, right? They kind of symbolize this great awakening, right? These ministers, they underscore these democratic tendencies of these New Testament gospels, of being free, right? Of around, not being stuck to one authority, one parish. Will later become, they will later be invoked when people are rallying for the liberties in the American Revolution. So it plants the seeds of individualism, right? This great awakening, even though it's a spiritual, it's a spiritual realm, there's no religion. Still, right? It has this social, political dimension of the individual being salvation of themselves. And think about this, right? Later on, it's gonna be the individual colonies, and they're gonna come together to fight the authority of Britain, right? This individualism, right? And that becomes character of the American nation. This individualism. uh, Also, one last thing, I guess, Great Awakening, it expanded printing across the colonies. And they would print out pamphlets and stuff, and little tenets of their beliefs. So that also expanded, I guess, the public sphere as well. All right, now let's talk about Imperial Rivalries. Now let's go kind of zoom out a little bit into greater colonies, into the greater world. So, so we have Spain, France, Britain. We also even have like the Russians up there in North California, and the Spanish and the Russians are kind of duking it out up there. Fort Ross, I think, is one of the forts that the Russians create, and then Spanish create San Francisco, and then eventually the Spanish take over and they move away, and the Russians move away. It was to control the fur trade up there, right? So you have Spain that controls what's the southwest now, New Mexico, California, down onto Mexico, and you also have Florida up to St. Augustine. And then you have the French that are claiming, at least these people are at least on paper claiming it. Just gotta keep in mind that in reality, it's Native Americans that have full control of the land still. These lands we're here I'm talking about. Mexico, California, Louisiana. Louisiana stretches all the way from Canada all the way south to the Mississippi River. So on paper, right, on these imperial maps that they have, right, Spanish North America, right, controls right New Mexico up to California, but in reality, it's just a little bit of outposts, some tiny little outposts. Right? Santa Fe, Albuquerque, Los Angeles, San Antonio. Right? Not that many people at all. Right? And that was the main problem with Spain, is that they didn't have a sizable population, settled population, to actually claim and settle this area up here in North America. They claim. The powerful nations such as like the Comanches and the Apaches, they were way more powerful than the Spanish in this area here. And I would want to break here and give you a focus to this book here by Pekka Hämäläinen, The Comanche Empire. It really talks about this, right? How it really goes against this idea, this popular myth, right? When the Europeans came, they just kind of like devastated the Indians and took over. Well, that did happen, but that's half the truth. There was nations, empires, the Comanches, and that were in control late into the 19th century, right? Mid 19th century, the 1850s, 1860s, when the demise kind of happened. From this time period here, it was the Comanches in control, right? So keep that in mind. Okay, so California, you have Fort Ross up there with the Russians. Then you have the string of presidial complexes. You have the Mission, which is run by Franciscan friars, by fathers, right, by priests, right, and then you have the Presidio, which is a military complex to protect that mission. And the whole thing here is to convert the Indians into loyal Spanish subjects. So you have Indians, you go in San Francisco, and San Antonio, or Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and the surrounding Indians try to convert their way of life from a hunting gathering existence to an agricultural sedentary urban existence under the auspices of Christianity. So this is so California was this mission frontier, and it was brutal for the Indians. Basically, it was basically like a genocide that happened there. There were, it completely changed the way of life for these Native Americans in California. Diseases and environmental changes completely devastated these Native Americans. So that's in California. So it's still right, partially populated, not that many people. Right? And that was one of the biggest, I guess, downfalls for the Spanish Empire. Whereas in Britain, it was already nearing 1 million people, and over here we have a couple of thousand. So in 1821, when Spanish rule came to an end and Mexico got its independence, 20 missions were operating with an average population of over 1,000. Indians or Californians, so these are California residents of Spanish these Californios, only numbered about 3,200 for the entire Spanish North America. Right? So that's that. So now let's move on to the French. The French at this time period in the 18th century, the 1700s, was by far England's biggest rival, both in the New World and in the Old. In North America, uh, French traders, or fur traders, had pushed into the Mississippi River Valley and into the Great Lakes, all the way down to New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama. So Mobile was founded in 1702, New Orleans in 1718. The St. Lawrence River Valley, or over there in French Canada, was kind of settled. Outposts were out there by 1750. So by 1750, you had a population of about 55,000 colonists out there in the St. Lawrence River Valley. Another 10,000 resided in what is Louisiana, mostly in the lower Mississippi and Gulf Coast areas, so New Orleans, Mobile. So more sizable than Spain, but not compared to England, not at all. Right? And so in 1750, there were about 1.5 million British colonists. This includes slaves, which greatly outnumbered the 65,000 French in North America, or the 3,500 in Spanish in North America. So basically, this giant piece of Louisiana was pretty much, I mean, even though French claimed it as theirs, it was controlled by Indians and Native Americans. And that's all they wanted. The French, that's all they wanted. They wanted to be friends with these Indians because of the fur trade. They wanted to take over. Or they had this lucrative colony in the New World in the West Indies, Guadeloupe, in Saint Martinique, sugar plantations in the Caribbean. They cared about that more than what they cared in the mainland in Louisiana. Nonetheless, right, these imperial rivalries created what we call the so-called middle ground. It's this borderland. There's this book here that I have by Richard White. And that's what it's called, The Middle Ground. And this particularly focuses on the Great Lakes region, and with the French, the Indians, and then the British, Anglo-Americans that came into there. This middle ground is like this borderland between European powers and Native American empires as well. And like these villages that sprung up in this so-called middle grounds. There's this mestizaje, this mixture, syncretism of Europeans and natives, and then eventually also slaves. So this middle ground is nobody has control of hegemony, power for what's going on in that area. Right? It's a middle ground, right? Nobody has full control of that full ground. It's a middle ground. That's what it means. One thing that the Indians were successful at doing when there was a middle ground, the French were here present in this area, in the Great Lakes, for example, was to play European powers off each other for their own benefit. This is what we called balance of power diplomacy. So they will make treaties with the French or make deals with the French, and then they will come around and make deals with the British. And then let the British and the French fight it out, and they will reap the benefits of that fight. That's what the Native Americans would do in this middle ground. And they were very adept at doing that for a while. So you have that, this balance of power diplomacy, the middle ground. And then also the French, right? I told you they really didn't care about much about the mainland. Right? They only cared about this as a training center, training hub for furs. But besides that, they didn't care much about to settle it here permanently as a British. And also, they tended to view North America as a place for exiles and prisoners to be sent towards. Um, so when the 7 Years' War did erupt, or the so-called French and Indian War, as we call it here in North America, and in Europe, they call it the Seven Years' War. And British came in victorious eventually. The French had no qualms of giving up Louisiana. Right? They were very, very precautious of retaining control of their Caribbean sugar plantation islands. So let's talk about the 7 Years' War now. Let me take a quick little break here. The 7 Years' War, also known as the French-Indian War. What happens here? So what happens here? What happens here? But one of the main things that happens here is the fault, I guess you could call it, of this private company called the Ohio Company, Virginia. Right? What is it called? What is it called exactly? The Ohio Company. So, all right. All right, so how do I start this 7 Year War? All right, so in 1747, so in 1747, you have these colonial land speculators who create the so-called Ohio Company of Virginia. I did this Ohio Company, and their purpose is to develop Western lands, to develop lands in what we call now Ohio. This is Ohio River Valley. And before 1750, very, very few settlers, white settlers, lived in that area. And this area was claimed by both Virginia and the French. So the King of England hired, right, basically charters the Ohio Company to develop lands in this western area, Ohio, to settle the land and to claim it for England, to take it away from France. So the idea here that we have here is that this is one of the justifications of how Europeans took away land from Native Americans. Is that right? If you don't have people there using the land, you can't really claim it. So Europeans would say this about Native Americans, right? Native Americans don't have really like big agricultural centers, right? They're most like hunter-gatherers. So they would claim that Native Americans were not using the land properly. Thus, they could claim it for them, Europeans. Anyways, let's go back to the Ohio Company, Virginia. So in 1747, you have these colonial speculators. In 1749, 2 years later, the Crown grants them 200,000 acres south of the Ohio River. And in return, they need to construct a fort, military fort, to secure it from the French and from the Native Americans there. So they move west, right, and a little bit north, these Virginians, and they find a pretty nice spot here where these two rivers, the Monongahela and the Allegheny Rivers, they come together. It's a confluence point. They form the Ohio River. Right, this is where present-day Pittsburgh, city of Pittsburgh, right, Pittsburgh Steelers are from. Right? But the French also had eyed that same location for their own fort they wanted to build. So in 1753, the Virginia governor sends this young major, who's barely 21 years old, out there to claim, right, to fight off the French for the area here. And guess who it is? George Washington. And he's untested. He hasn't gone to battle yet. This is his first battle at age 21. So in 1753, they set off and they right there at the fork of the Ohio River. There's a French battalion there that outnumbers George Washington. So George Washington creates this fort called Fort Necessity, and it's a pitiful little fort. And it gets outnumbered and it gets outrun and he has to be abandoned. He surrenders, right? He can't fight off the French here. And the French instead, now they have control of this land now, the Ohio River commons, and they create Fort Duquesne, which will literally is now Pittsburgh. So the French are the first ones to lay claim and build a fort there in this area, right? Fort Duquesne, coveted site in the Ohio River. So May 28th, 1754, you have another skirmish. About 10 French soldiers are killed. And this is which would lead up to the first truly global war, right? The 7 Years' War. So with about 450 men, a meager amount of supplies, Washington has his Fort Necessity. By 1754, that summer, what is it? By 1754, that summer, there's fears that the French are going to ally themselves with the natives, and they're going to easily overrun, even invade these North American colonies, Pennsylvania, that's out there. So you have Benjamin Franklin, under the orders of the king, actually, to come together in Albany, New York, and create like this union. Right? And this is called the Albany Plan of Union. It's drafted by Benjamin. And the idea here is that the colonies are going to come together, and it's going to create this like assembly. Right? And each colony is going to have representatives in these assemblies. They're going to have the power to tax the colonies uniformly, collectively, to raise an army, and to wage war against France and its Indian allies. That's why it's called the French and Indian War, because the French and the Indians became allies here to try to fight off the British. And of course, the British also had a couple of Indian allies, but most Indians went with the French first. So anyways, you have the Albany Congress, right? The Albany Plan. But that doesn't get ratified by no colonies. No colonies wants to get into that. And remember, there's no unified identity here. There's no American identity yet. Each colony is its own independent colony. They didn't get the Albany Plan of Union. Anyways, what happens that on July the 3rd, on that same year, one of the main reasons why this doesn't get approved is because most of the colonists here, the representatives, the delegates that were sent to Albany, they hear of George Washington's defeat at Fort Duquesne or Fort Necessity. So now the crown. So now they're in retreat at Virginia near George Washington. So now the crown has to, I guess, reassemble and re-strategize. So now they send this general, Edward Braddock, straight from England, and along with 2 regiments of Irish to America. So in early 1755, they arrive in Virginia. They make preparations to go try to reconquer, I guess. But it's now Fort Duquesne. So next month, the following month in June, they set off to march outwards. Fort Duquesne / Virginia. At first, it goes terrible for the British. A French and Indian force ambushes Braddock near a forest in Fort Duquesne and nearly cuts the into pieces, basically. Terrible defeat. It's a total defeat for the British Army. And from here, the Indians get enough courage and they go and attack, these frontiers, the backcountry of Pennsylvania, Virginia, the white settlers, British settlers. And it's going really bad for the British. had to again reassemble and re-strategize. So the Crowns have a new prime minister now. Would be in. Which would this be in? 1759, 58. But anyways, they have a new prime minister in England. This guy named William Pitt. He's a member of the House of Commons, and he's a staunch expansionist. He's committed to expanding the Imperial Britain as much as he can, not just in North America, but also across the world. So what's going on here is that, so just think about William Pitt's strategy here, right? So what he does is that, so because the French and the British set off this world war. This world war because they're not just only fighting here in the North American colonies. They're also fighting for colonies in the Caribbean, in Asia, in India as well. So it's really a global war. 7 Years' War is the first truly global war. Right? So British and French colonies are fighting each other. Right? So William Pitt's strategy here is that in Europe, Britain, continental Europe, Britain is no match for the French army, at least on land. So what William Pitt does is that he refocuses all his energy and resources to the fights on the colonies, not in continental Europe, but the colonies. Which is where, and especially in France's most vulnerable colonies, which is the North American colonies, overseas colonies, which are sparsely populated, right, as compared to what the British have. So under Pitt, British brought in the war into a truly global conflict, and they take advantage of British superior naval power, and they fight on the coast of Asia and Africa and North America. So by 1758, Britain has taken this costly military buildup, just in America alone here, nearly 50,000 troops in America. And in order to, to support this endeavor, which is super costly, and to win the support of the colonists, William Pitt, this prime minister, promises the colonists to reimburse the colonies for any expenses that they incurred during this French-Indian War or 7 Years' War. So right away, got a bunch of guns, and ammunition, and supplies comes from the south up north to fight the French and the Indians up here in the Ohio River Valley. In July 1758, Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario falls. In November 1758, the French themselves destroy their own Fort Duquesne, and they abandon Fort Duquesne. And then the British seize it, The British are able to seize that Fort Duquesne that was destroyed by the French, and they rename it. And they rename it Fort. That's why it's called Pittsburgh now, after William Pitt, Prime Minister. All right. Finally, they move on, the British, and they move on to Quebec, into the St. Lawrence River, and into Quebec itself, city Quebec. William Pitt knows that if you take Quebec away from the French, it all falls apart. So Quebec is the main thing to get here. You would conquer Canada. But before that, they also conquered Fort Niagara, Lake Ontario. They also conquer Ticonderoga Fort Ticonderoga, from Lake Champlain, and now only Quebec is left. And they've tried this before. It failed to invade Quebec. There's this guy James Wolfe. Uh, so in September 12th, basically when Quebec, or starting in September 12th, what they do is that Quebec is really well fortified with these massive walls. But there's this river that runs across it, around it, and the British kind of like sneak their way across the river behind French guards. And there's like on the south side of the city, it's pretty. The walls are like more vulnerable, and where the British attack, and that's where they're able to do it. So on September 12th is when they do that little sneak attack, and the Plains of Abraham, as it's known. The British and the French commanders both lose their life. It was a really intense battle here for Quebec. But eventually the British win after I think it's 4 days or so. Yeah, 4 days. The French surrender. And now finally the British conquer Canada. All that area there. So now you have so the British conquer not just Canada, but they conquer global war. So what they conquer? What is the fruits of this war here? Winning the 7-Year War. The British conquer French posts in India. They took French Senegal on the West African coast, and they also seized those valuable sugar islands, Martinique and Guadeloupe, the West Indies. The British also got the Philippines and Havana in Cuba. Spain entered the war as well in 1762 towards the end on the side of the French, trying to help with the French, and they lost. So that's what the British got. However, so that was that. So now that you have that was like the initial winning of the war, and then you have the Treaty of Paris of 1763. This is what officially ends the war. And then basically what happens here is that the Europeans negotiate what they're going to get, what colonies are going to get, what who. So remember that Louisiana is still there for French. Right? Until the Treaty of Paris. So first what happens is that France cedes to Spain Louisiana, or the port of New Orleans. So New Orleans is given to Spain by the French first. And then all of the Louisiana territory, west of the Mississippi River. Then in 1763, in this Treaty of Paris, Spain turns over Florida to Britain in return for Havana, for Cuba, and for the Philippines. France then gives everything it holds between Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, as well as Canada, in order, in return, France gets back those sugar islands in the West Indies, Guadeloupe and Martinique. And also France gets to retain fishing rights off Newfoundland. I mean, long story short, basically, at the end of the French-Indian War, the 7-Year War, France is no longer a threat in North American land, at least. So Spain acquires Louisiana. The British colonies acquire that Ohio River Valley, Canada, as well as into the Mississippi River Valley. And then west of the Mississippi is Spain's now. So basically, I mean, it's the 2-year-old presence of France in this North American continent, and it disappears overnight. the signing of the Treaty of Paris of 1763. So now the entire continent east of the Mississippi River is firmly in British hands. Nonetheless, it was a resounding victory for Britain, right? They put a heavy toe in tax and burden on the British colonists and on Britain itself because it was so costly. As a matter of fact, all the participants of the 7-Year War, this French Indian War, a heavy toll afterwards as a consequence of how costly this war was. So in 30 years, right within 3 decades, because of so much turmoil caused by the 7 Years War, France goes into the French Revolution. And Britain, right, even earlier than French, goes into its own revolution in the colonies, the American Revolution. All right. So super costly war. And then right following the 7 years, at the end of the 7 Years War, there's a huge rebellion, this Native American rebellion against the British, because they know, right? This has been right that the Native Americans, they're middle ground no more. They can't play off different European powers off each other no more. So now they're ever more dependent on the British, and the British have never been nice to them, not the French at least, right? So some are like, what do we do now? And they realize, like, okay, now is the perfect time to rebel and attack Britain. We just got over this costly war, right? And we're not gonna, be dominated by them. So in 1763, the same year, right, the end of the war, right, the Treaty of Paris is still the ink is still drying off in the Treaty of Paris. Indians in this Ohio River Valley and in the Great Lakes, they launched a revolt against British rule, against the British Empire, the colonists. This is now known as Pontiac's Rebellion. In the way Pontiac's Rebellion, and Pontiac is like a leader of, I think he's the Delawares. Is Ottawa. Sorry, the Ottawas. And he's under the influence, or he's very influenced by this spiritual leader, Neolin. This is kind of one of these revivals, these religious revivals. And Neolin is a Delaware religious prophet. So the Delawares is a different religious tribe. And he has a vision. Right? This guy Neolin has a vision. The master of life, right? God, I guess, right? The deity for him gives them in this vision. They have to go back to their own traditional way of life. They have to cut and reject all European technology and free themselves from any commercial ties with any whites, any Europeans. And they have to, so this means like getting rid of their dependence on alcohol, on weapons, and just go back to where it was before European contact. This is the vision that he has. In order to save themselves, they have to do this. Right? And they have to you have to drive out the British away from their ancestral territory. That's the only way. This is the vision that this Neolin has. This is the only way their people are going to survive. And then, moreover, besides this intense vision that he has, he also mixes this vision, this message, with the concept of pan-Indian identity. What is this pan-Indian identity? Is that what Neolin preached in this pan-Indian identity is that all Indians were one people. Right? Enough bickering between different little tribes, we're all the same. And more importantly, we are all under the threat and danger of white Europeans. We need to create this pan-Indian, right? This across Indian nations and create this one alliance against British rule. And it takes off. The ideas take off over there in the Ohio Valley and in the Great Lakes region. So only through cooperation could they regain their lost independence, says the old. And I mean, long story short, I mean, this becomes brutally suppressed. Pontiac Rebellion becomes brutally suppressed. But it does indicate, at least to the British Crown, that you got to do something about this Indian problem. And the Indian problem, the root of this Indian problem is that British settlers are ever increasingly encroaching on Native American land. So what the Crown, the British Crown, thinks up right here is the so-called Proclamation of 1763, the Proclamation Line of 1763. So in order to avoid this constant warfare on the border, on the frontiers here between British colonies and Native American land, we're going to make law now across the colonies. This is royal law, right? Straight from the Crown, Proclamation Line of 1763, prohibiting further colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So this means that the Indians will keep the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi, right? Anything west of the Appalachian Mountains, that's going to be reserved for Native American land. And that's a big chunk of land. This should be, I don't know if you can see it here. I don't know if I can see it. But it's like the line that cuts across right there, the Appalachians. The Appalachian Mountains. And so these lands were reserved exclusively for Indians. Moreover, this law said also as well, is that it banned the sale of Indian land to private individuals. Only colonial governments could arrange such negotiations. So all these land speculators, right, such like the Ohio Company or Virginia, they can't do that no more. It's going to be under colonial government that are under the auspices of the Crown. So don't get me wrong, this law was not really to protect the Indians. It was really to for the Crown to avoid more costly wars in their North American colonial frontiers. However, this proclamation of 1763 pissed the fuck off the settlers and the speculators, especially the land speculators. That think about it, had just fought 7 fucking years, right, against this French and the Indians for that fucking purpose. Their land, for their casting, is across the Appalachian. Right? The St. Lawrence River Valley, the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi River, all that land that we were fighting for in the 7-Year War, the French-Indian War. Now you're not going to let us go and settle it? Well, fuck you, King. That's basically what the settlers said right here, with this proclamation line. For example, a lot of the colonies just straight up just ignored the proclamation line. They went and settled and bought land from the Indians. A perfect example is George Washington. Right, he was an agent of the Ohio Company. Right, he was a land speculator himself. Right, he ordered his own agents, right, his land speculators, buy up as much land as possible while keeping these transactions secrets because they were illegal. And George Washington, right, the father of our country, right, doing some illegal shit here. Tells you much about the U.S. here, right? So basically, the proclamation line of 1763 just further just grew tensions between the settlers, colonists, and the Crown even more to a tipping point. And I'm sure you all know what's going to happen next. Right? This is reasons why that's going to lead directly towards the American Revolution. This hunger for land, for Native American land. And that's a really big concept for American history. All right, this is the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 will begin with even more reasons why the settlers got even more pissed off at the crown, and eventually went to war against Britain and created the wonderful nation of the U.S. See you next time for chapter 5, guys. Thanks, and stay safe.